Hi, everybody. I am Stephen Levitsky. I'm the director of the David Rockefeller Center for Latin American Studies here at Harvard. Welcome to our Tuesday seminar webinar version, which is the hybrid version this week. I am joined, is Fran with me? Is she online? Anyway, I'm definitely joined by my awesome co-chair, Professor Alicia Holland. I hope that I'm joined by my other co-chair, Fran Agopian, online. Last week, we talked about the struggles of centrist parties in Latin America. Today, we turn to the struggle of political parties in general, left, center, or right. If you are an established political party in Latin America and you're not Uruguayan, chances are you are in trouble. When party systems collapsed in Peru and Venezuela a quarter of a century ago, those cases were mostly treated as kind of unfortunate outliers. But over the last 2 decades, established parties and even established party systems have weakened or collapsed across much, if not most, of Latin America, even in countries that were thought to have pretty stable party systems: Chile, Costa Rica, Mexico. In fact, Argentina, Chile, Colombia, Costa Rica, El Salvador, Mexico, and Honduras, I may be missing one or two, are currently governed by new movements or political outsiders who defeated all of the established political parties, often in humiliating fashion.
Yeah.
So the question is, why the hell has this happened? Why is it happening now? And what are the consequences? What are the political consequences of party and party system meltdown across Latin America? And to answer that question, we brought in 3 of the smartest individuals and best scholars of political parties in Latin America that I know of. I will introduce them in alphabetical order, and then they will speak in alphabetical order. First and best dressed is Fernando Bizzarro. He is assistant professor. We couldn't always say that about you, Fernando. He is assistant professor of political science at Boston College. He is a PhD from the government department here at Harvard, and is a good friend of Dr. Glass. He researches political parties and democracy in Latin America. As many of you know, he's published quite widely, often in collaboration with Scott Mainwaring, on party strength, on party system institutionalization, and their relationship to democracy and other outcomes. Welcome, Fernando. We appreciate you joining us. Secondly, Juan Pablo Luna, who is the professor in the School of Government at the Catholic University in Chile, but only for a while longer, because beginning in January, he will be the Diamond Brown Chair in Democratic Studies at McGill University. So we'll be flipping from the south of us to the north of us. Professor Luna, many of you know, is really one of the leading scholars in contemporary Latin American politics. Punto. He's a scholar of state capacity, social inequality and its consequences, and of course, political parties and party systems. He's author of a terrific book, Segmented Representation: Political Party Strategies in Unequal Democracies. He's editor of a couple of important volumes on parties, one on Latin American party systems, the other on the resilience of the Latin American right. And it's worth noting that he wrote, now many years ago, about 15 years ago, a piece with David Altman that was one of the first to highlight the vulnerabilities of the Chilean party system. So welcome, Juan Pablo. It's great to have you back. And third, Jana Morgan is professor of political science at the University of Tennessee and a visiting fellow currently at the Wilson Center for International Scholars. She is an expert on issues of inequality and problems of political representation. She's author of a terrific book, Bankrupt Representation and Party System Collapse, which is an award-winning book on the meltdown of the party system in Venezuela. She's also co-author more recently of Hijacking the Agenda: Economic Power and Political Influence, which came out a few years ago. That's mainly in the United States. Welcome, Jana. It's great to have you here. All right, I'm going to shut up and turn the floor over to Fernando.
Okay. Let me get this right. Okay. Well, thank you, Steve. Thank you, everyone, for coming, and Dr. Glass for inviting me. It's good to be back here. I can't get away. And I'm really honored to be in this panel with both Jana and Juan Pablo, whose work I have followed and read and learned from so much. I'm actually teaching Latin American politics using Juan Pablo's textbook in an hour and a half, so it's pretty good. So over the summer, I and Jana and Juan Pablo got an email that read, Frank Hagopian, Alicia Holland, and Stephen Levitsky invite you to speak at a panel that seeks to answer the question, why have parties failed? Now, when you are someone like me, someone who learned everything they know about politics from Frank Hagopian, Alicia Holland, and Stephen Levitsky, if they ask you, why have parties failed? Your instinctive answer is, if you don't know, how the hell am I supposed to know? So as to why have parties fail, my short answer is, I don't know. At least not for sure. But since I need to provide 10 minutes of lunchtime entertainment, here's my best shot. So Latin American parties have failed because they are weak links to hard knots. In other words, most Latin American political parties are fragile institutions trying to grapple with deeply entrenched, multifaceted problems that are neither equipped nor structured to solve. It's not just a matter of poor strategies or bad leadership. It's more fundamental than that. Most Latin American parties are simply too weak to untangle the complex and deeply rooted issues that define the region's politics today. And these challenges are so complex and difficult that even the region's strongest parties have been battered and sometimes defeated by them. Three challenges are particularly thorny. First, Latin America has experienced a structural transformation of its public sphere. Every voter has a cell phone. Most people consume political information shared by friends and family on WhatsApp. Even Steve created a Twitter account at some point. It doesn't get more structural transformation than that. The emergence of mass social media has fundamentally changed the way political influence and political articulation work in the region. And both shifts to influence and articulation are crucial to understanding why parties have lost ground, in my view. So let's take influence first. Social media has empowered voters and political outsiders like never before. Any concerned citizen is now a political influencer. As a result, the voices of political parties are drowned out in a crowded, noisy marketplace of ideas, where anyone with a smartphone can sway public opinion. To be clear, party voices were never strong in Latin America. With a few exceptions, the ones who shout in the region are individual politicians. Parties at most whisper. Parties have always lacked the resources, the legitimacy, and the confidence to speak to voters and have them listen. This is, as some of my work has tried to show, in part thanks to the high levels of economic inequality in the region that empower wealthy politicians to speak freely without fearing partisan control. Regardless of its sources, however, the truth is that these meek parties are now trying to deliver messages in contexts in which everyone, including our uncle, are shouting in all caps. But there's more, right? In the past, parties were one of the few political actors trying to articulate interest by speaking to voters about political issues. While parties have no monopoly over articulation, parties were one of the few organizations in charge of packaging ideas, framing debates, and guiding the conversation. But with social media, that entire dynamic has flipped. Now voters are not just passively listening or waiting until election day to talk back to their vote. Instead, voters are talking to each other, mobilizing, and even engaging directly with parties in real time. They're voicing opinions, organizing protests, and calling out party leaders, sometimes within hours of a political event or announcement. This direct interaction, while empowering for most voters, has left parties scrambling. They can no longer articulate interests the way they once did. Now many interests get articulated even before parties hear about what's going on. The once one-way conversations where parties deliver their message to the masses has become a noisy, unpredictable dialogue. And parties already weak are now out of step with this new, more decentralized political landscape. Second, decades of unresolved governance issues, especially those related to security, corruption, and the delivery of public services, has tested the patience of Latin American voters to the breaking point. In the past, parties could buy time by selling voters on gradual reforms or the promise of improvements down the line. And there were a couple of reasons for this. For one, democracy was still relatively new in many parts of Latin America, and voters were willing to give it the benefit of the doubt. They believed that given time, democracy would deliver. And in other cases, lucky draws, like the commodity boom, created a sense of optimism, as growth made it seem like progress was happening, even if it's slowly. People were hopeful that better days were just around the corner. But today, that hope has eroded. People are tired of waiting, and they expect quick solutions to deeply ingrained problems. The sense of urgency has shifted. Voters want results now, not abstract promises or plans that might work in 5 or 10 years. And here's the dilemma, right? Political parties, due to their own nature, are notoriously bad at delivering the kind of immediacy voters now demand in Latin America. Policymaking inside political parties is almost always slow and opaque, bogged down by internal debates, coalition building, and compromises. And voters ain't got time for that. In weak parties, this process is even more dysfunctional. Weak parties generally don't have the policy depth needed to come up with effective solutions to complex problems. They lack the connections to skilled professionals, to academics, to civil society activists, who can offer innovative ideas or help craft detailed policy. Instead, these weak parties are often filled with inexperienced politicians, people who may not fully understand the policymaking process or who lack the political savvy to navigate the system. The solutions they offer, when they do propose something bold or simple, are just bad policy. Now you might say, but that's exactly the kind of policies voters are supporting. When Latin America's strong parties fail to come up with simple solutions to complicated problems, voters have supported outsiders who offer precisely these simple solutions, no matter how bad and unrealistic they are. Well, that would be a good observation. But here's the kicker in my view. Even when parties try to present easy or immediate solutions, voters don't trust them. Political parties carry too much baggage, too many associations with past failures, broken promises, and corruption. When parties propose something that sounds too good to be true, voters realize it usually is. This is why political outsiders, often saying the exact same things, are more effective. They haven't been tainted by repeated failures in the same way. A populist outsider can shout an easy solution to a complicated problem, and people will listen, because they seem like a fresh alternative, uncorrupted by years of broken promises. It's a cruel irony then. Even when parties try to simplify, their words ring hollow. In this environment, outsiders peddling simplistic solutions, no matter how unrealistic, have become the seductive alternative. Third, even the strongest of Latin American political parties harbor a critical blind spot. Forged in the fires of the region's transition to democracy, many have a complex and often conflicted relationship with issues of public security. This is because these parties came of age during a period when the discourse surrounding police and state repression was framed primarily around human rights, not around effective public service delivery. While this focus was essential for democratization, it left many parties ill-prepared to address what has arguably become the most pressing issue in contemporary Latin America: the rise of organized crime and unchecked criminal violence. So this birth defect has had profound consequences. Latin American parties, especially the Latin American left, struggles to articulate a clear and compelling message on security issues. This ambiguity makes them vulnerable to criticism from both sides of the political spectrum and leaves them struggling to resonate with a public that increasingly demands decisive action. So the very parties that could rise to the current occasion, right, the ones with the organizational muscle to weather the storm of social media, to respond to the rising tide of voter impatience, and to craft effective policy response to popular needs, are often the same parties that suffer the most from this blind spot regarding Latin America's most important problem. Now, there are a few ways to picture the process I'm describing, but I propose that we take a look at the case I know best, and that's Brazil. Between 2015 and 2018, everything we thought we knew about Brazilian politics was turned upside down. The role of money in election transformed. The importance of alliance between candidates at different levels, out of the window. Holding office as a ticket to re-election, not anymore. Instead, electoral success came through what our friend Jidea Trudeau once described as half a dozen dudes sharing fart jokes on WhatsApp. At the same time, the shock from the Lava Jato operation, followed by the country's economic and political collapse, left voters completely exhausted. By 2018, there was a deep sense of malaise that seemed to shape every political interaction. Organized crime, once concentrated in Rio and São Paulo, spread everywhere. Today, poor communities in the peripheries of even medium-sized towns are dominated by criminal organizations. Voters in small rural towns fear what's now called the Novo Cangaço, a wave of violent raids on banks and shipping companies by criminal groups hunting for cash and goods. So how have the Brazilian parties fared in face of all these challenges? Well, on one hand, take the Workers' Party. It would be hard to find another party that survived the kind of political and judicial nightmare the PT went through between 2015 and 2018. A majority of Brazilians were disgusted by the party's very name. Yet just 5 years later, he governs Brazil. He holds a large congressional delegation and remains the country's most important political party. So he took a hard beating, but the PT is still alive and kicking. Now contrast that with the fate of the PT's historical rival, the Party of the Brazilian Social Democracy, the PSDB. To call today's PSDB a shell of its former self would be an understatement. The party has all but vanished, both electorally and organizationally. And why? Because it failed to rise to these new challenges. While the PSDB watched, a new right seized on the structural transformation of the public sphere to build a more effective anti-petismo. Even though the PSDB did manage to bring down homicide rates in São Paulo to levels lower than in many major US cities during its time in power, it never succeeded in presenting itself as an effective force in fighting crime nationwide. And then at the most critical moment in Brazil's history, recent history, Dilma Rousseff's impeachment, the PSDB hesitated. It hesitated again. By the time it finally jumped on the bandwagon, supporting her removal after everything had already been said and done, voters had noticed. The PSDB no longer led the opposition to the PT. And from there, it was just a short walk to political annihilation. So in other words, Brazil has changed in ways that made life much harder for political parties. Every party has suffered the consequences of these changes. But the weaker of the two major parties, the PSDB, was the first to be devoured by the new political landscape. That's what I had. Thank you.
Thanks, Fernando. Juan Pablo, you're up.
Okay. Thanks, Steve, Alicia, and Fran for the invite. It's always great to be back to Dr. Class, even if virtually, and to share with Fernando and Jana the panel. Let me first start with a bold statement, because I think we need to grapple with it more than we usually do. Right? What you invited us to is more an exercise on forensics than on physiology. Right? There are dead bodies here, right? So we call them parties, but they are no longer functional as such in the way we think parties make and enable political representation in democratic societies. And the fact is, I think, and this is what we should be grappling with, in my view, that we don't know what and how could work to restructure political representation in contemporary democracies, but I'm pretty sure parties won't be able to do it as we had it, as we had them, right? And in that note, I think we should start to think, and this is kind of our research frontier, how to rebuild representation in liberal democracies without parties. Right? Let me just push this argument a little bit more by referencing the paper by Steve and Max Cameron, 2003, Democracy Without Parties in Peru. Right? In that paper, I mean, they grappled with the fact that Peruvian party system had collapsed, but the expectation was that a new party system would eventually take form, right, and shape up. 21 years later, most of the world, not only Latin America, looks closer to that Peruvian scenario than Peru has been able to resurrect anything like a party, not even a party system, right? So I think we should let that sink in for a minute. We are used to analyzing political parties. We see political parties in things that call themselves political parties, but they don't work as political parties did for structuring democratic representation in the past. And this is not only Latin America, this is something that has taken over the world, I would say. Now, why are parties we had dying without replacement, right? Because what we are seeing in particularly in Latin America is the collapse or the decay of traditional party systems without replacement, and there is a ton of infant mortality in party land, right? Most of the parties that are created last one election, collapse rapidly. Even if they win the election, they tend to break down and rapidly fade away. So the short answer, and I will echo something that Fernando just said about like societal change. It's crucial in my view, and the only thing I could add to what Fernando has said about that is that it's not only social networks, and I would say it's not primarily social networks. They have catalyzed the process, but I think there is something about post-industrial societal dynamics, the types of inequality and segregation and individualism that we have around in these new social structures that have emerged, have a lot to do with I think what we are seeing and looking at. And in that sense, I think we need much more sociology and political sociology than political science to understand what's happening with political parties. I think this has like party crisis is everywhere, no matter how institutions look like, and you can see differences in terms of the format in which party weakening has taken place. For instance, in the US, you still have the two-party system, and it externally looks like something that has always been around. But if you look internally at the parties, you see a lot of change, and many of the things you see elsewhere in the region and elsewhere. Besides societal change, and this also has to do with something that Fernando alluded to in terms of the security issue, but I think it's broader than that. It has to do with eroding state capacity, right? And this eroding state capacity has to do with things that relate to security, organized crime, illegal markets, and this is obviously a primary factor in Latin America, but also it has to do with things like the political economy of a global society in which big tech versus other type of capitalist enterprises has taken over, and it's a huge driving force of the socio-economic dynamics that we see shaping up in different places in the world. And I'm thinking about labor dynamics and labor economics and how this shapes up organizational factors in society and so on. So I think if you look at the macro structures that were accompanying liberal democracy in the last 100 years, those macro structures were industrial societies and nation states. Both have faded away, right? And without the political economy implications of those two macro structures, I think political parties are having a hard time in terms of structuring representation in society. So essentially, let me put this in somewhat more abstract terms, but I think it might make sense. Parties did two things for democracy in society, right? They stretched time, right? Either through adherence to leadership, a leadership you could trust, either through party identification, right, that provided party leaders time to govern, right, and time to synchronize the subjective needs with objective timing of public policies, right? This inability to perform has to do with politicians' current inability to synchronize time, synchronize social time, demands that they receive from society, and their capacity to deliver on those demands, right? So one thing that representation did was to stretch time and to synchronize societal time with politicians and public policy timing. The other thing the political parties did was to compress space, right? You have multiple conflicts and lines of grievance in society, but parties could structure representation around 1-2 cleavages that essentially bundle these conflicts together in a meaningful way for society. Given the societal change we have seen in the last few decades, given the progressive weakening of state capacity and state power, what I think we are seeing today is that for political parties, a space has bifurcated and time has compressed, right? So it's essentially the opposite of what you needed and the opposite of what parties used to provide in society. And in this context, you see the left and the right pursuing adaptation strategies that are non-sustainable, right? The left has engaged in identity politics, trying to represent a multitude of small groups, right, that have to do with this explosion of conflict without aggregation in society. And the right is promising a return to an orderly past, right? And both of them are essentially unfeasible in the short to long run. They might help politicians win elections on these platforms, but rapidly they have to confront time compression and space bifurcation. And this turns out to like or ends up in their inability to deliver and to eventually sustain their rules, sustain their legitimacy, and sustain their organizations. Speaking of organizations, and I will finish on this note, the other thing that has happened is that the value of organizations to win elections and to structure politicians' careers has collapsed, right? These politicians are now competing in a context of strong anti-identities, right? In a context in which anti-politics or anti-state, even if you think of places like Argentina and Milei, right? Anti-statist attitudes, anti-politicians attitudes are very prevalent. And in this context, they have and face incentives to break apart and to try to run as independent platforms. With that, we essentially leveraging this illusion that they can structure a top-down connection and a top-down mobilization of electoral bases through social media, through traditional media, through political communication, right? And this type of like electoral competition essentially has broken down the party organizations we used to have, through which politicians and aspiring politicians could grow slowly within an organization that then when they win an election enabled them to govern, right? Now politicians can grow very rapidly electorally, but when they reach office, they cannot govern because they are no longer part of this organizational infrastructure that allowed them to govern effectively, right? Two more points, and I finish with this, Steve. I think I have like 1 more minute. One is generational change, and this is something that it's not nice, but we should also, I think, throw it in the table, and you have done it yourself in your previous work. The parties we now miss were blood communities from a violent past. They were forged in a violent past, and that violent past was instrumental in generating cohesion, in generating loyalty within party organizations that new generations lack. And societies have cycles of violence and cooperation. The last cycle of violence is probably too long ago, happened too long ago. And some of the good things that violence eventually creates for peaceful times are no longer there. And I'm sorry to put that up there, but I think that's important to have on the table for discussion. And the other thing is the structural challenges and the structural phenomena I try to refer to very rapidly here in this presentation also affect populist leaders that we see as the alternative to institutionalized political party rule, right? Many populists today confront the same type of challenges when they have to govern than the political parties that we are missing here, or are kind of like dissecting in our autopsy in this exercise, right? So we tend to think that either we have institutionalized parties or populist leaders, and that those populist leaders can eventually entrench themselves and institutionalize their rule. My sense is that they are also coming and going more rapidly than they did in the past. Thank you very much. I'm sorry if I took too long.
Thanks, Juan Pablo. Jana, you're up.
Hey, everybody. Thanks for the invite, and greetings from my office in New Jersey. I'm still figuring out lighting, so I look like I don't know, I have like a halo coming at me. So anyway, you'll just have to think of me in heavenly terms, I guess. So it's great to be here today to talk with all of you about such an important and really pressing challenge for Latin American democracies. I want to make basically 2 core points in my remarks. First of all, that parties fail when changing representational demands cannot be easily satisfied within the logics of existing party organizations. And secondly, that these unresolved representation gaps not only lead to party and party system decay, but they also open the door to anti-system outsiders and contribute to polarization around the value and meaning of democracy. So the guardrails we build to protect democracy shouldn't just stop with investment in institutions and procedures. Rather, protecting democratic institutions means advancing substantive representation, especially for those most marginalized. So let me just elaborate on these points. So as we generally think, parties should exist primarily to link society to the state. And in this role, parties are meant to structure competition between various groups, their diverse interests, and their potentially divergent views of society. In my previous work, I've shown how failure to sustain linkage leads to party decay and can even culminate in system-wide collapse. Parties become vulnerable to this kind of failure when structural changes not only challenge the viability of their core linkage strategies, but when the kinds of organizational adaptations that would be necessary to respond to these shifts would place the party in conflict with its core policy commitments or its core constituencies. In essence, party organizations are born in particular historical moments, and they succeed initially because their linkage logics align with the representational demands that exist in that moment. As long as the essential nature of representational demands remains relatively constant, not necessarily the precise demands, but the underlying logic that drives those demands, then a party can make the adjustments necessary to remain relevant. However, when the representational environment changes such that new linkage demands conflict with parties' established patterns, then a more fundamental overhaul of linkage logics is required. Overhauling linkage logics, to put it mildly, is challenging. First, because party organizations are adapted to the old logic, and there are significant headwinds that simply make change difficult. But more importantly, when the logic of linkage needs to transform in fundamental ways, then adaptation not only requires reaching out to new constituencies or reimagining the kinds of policies that respond to new societal contexts, these adaptations actually mean moving away from old, reliable constituencies. So while this kind of adaptation may be necessary for the party or party system to survive, there are really strong incentives to stick with the tried and true. And even if parties attempt to change, their adaptive efforts are likely to involve a lot of miscalculations and missteps, which limit the likelihood that they'll be successful. And I want to emphasize that, in my view, this is not just about poor performance. That's certainly part of it, but it's much more than that. It's about a basic fundamental misalignment between parties' representational or organizational logics and the kinds of unmet demands that they are being pressed to address. If this kind of misalignment exists, then regular adjustments are going to be insufficient. My previous work has shown how this process is played out in Venezuela and in Bolivia and in other instances of party system collapse in the region and beyond. And I want to emphasize that I think that these were not one-offs, like Steve said we all thought back when it initially happened, but rather that these are repeating processes now that we can see recurring in other places as well. And in some more recent work with Carlos Melendez, I've also argued that a parallel process has been at work in Chile, where the fundamental representational logics of the post-transition period have largely lost their relevance, and the established parties there have struggled mightily to integrate new kinds of interests and concerns that have emerged there of late. So when significant structural changes put pressure on linkage and organizational constraints impede successful adaptation, substantial linkage gaps are likely to be exposed and, importantly, to remain unresolved. This failure to resolve linkage gaps puts parties at risk to the emergence of new actors who are promising to fill the gap. These actors are responding to the failures of the existing parties, and they're appealing to interests and constituencies that feel marginalized within the status quo. Put simply, these are likely to be anti-system actors, often populists who introduce what Jennifer McCoy and Murat Somer have called pernicious polarization, and what Ken Roberts has written about as institutional polarization. This form of polarization goes well beyond just ordinary ideological differences and involves fundamental contestation over the rules of the game and over who has the power to control the state and determine what constitutes the public good. So these differences in types of polarization are more than just semantic. The typical form of polarization around policy differences is often good and healthy for democratic competition. The second type of polarization around the importance of democratic procedures can be much more problematic and has the potential to produce significant democratic backsliding. And the Venezuelan experience can help us see some of the worst possible outcomes that can follow from this scenario. And it offers us a cautionary tale concerning some potentially similar processes throughout the region. Thus, party decay opens the door to populist actors who promise to fill representational gaps and who contribute to more than just simple ideological polarization, but who activate deep divides around the fundamental rules of the game. And this brings me to my second major point, which is that shoring up democratic institutions requires much more than attention to the kinds of rules and procedures that we political scientists tend to emphasize, because concern that's confined to simply following the procedures of liberal democracy means that we tend to overlook the numerous instances when these institutional guarantees are not really actualized and the representational promises of democracy fall short. These substantive representational failings place core democratic institutions like political parties at risk and also contribute to undermining the legitimacy of the democratic system overall. As a result, people who feel marginalized from the system may look to extra institutional alternatives. At the same time, and I want to emphasize this point, those who benefit from incomplete democracy become more entrenched in their resistance to the kinds of substantive changes that would actually strengthen democracy and extend its reach to include those who are pushed to the side. This combination of entrenched resistance to deepening democracy alongside festering frustration is a recipe for the kind of ruptures that we've begun to see across the region, beginning with Venezuela and continuing through more recent events in places like Peru. When scholars and policymakers focus exclusively on the procedures of democracy, such as free and fair elections or checks and balances, we tend to lose track of the purposes these procedures are meant to serve. As my current line of work with Nate Kelly suggests, democracy's substantive success is also essential to its survival. In that work, we argue that entrenched racialized hierarchies and ongoing exclusion cause grave harm to the legitimacy and viability of democratic ideals and institutions. And here I agree with Juan Pablo's point about the need to think about the sociological underpinnings of parties and democracies. And I would argue that the problem is not really a new one, but continued failings to address longstanding and persistent marginalization, and not just about the strength of the state, but about who benefits from the allocation of state power. In other words, the same kinds of unresolved representational shortcomings that put individual parties and party systems at risk also contribute to undermining democracy itself. So while democracy advocates often focus on institutions and procedures, perhaps out of a completely legitimate concern that blurring the line between processes and outcomes enhances the risk of a shift toward anti-democratic populism, in our work, we suggest that citizens are deeply attentive to issues of inequality and exclusion in their evaluations of representational institutions like democracy, and even in their support for democracy itself. So shoring up democracy requires investing in expansive representational projects within the context of stable parties and other democratic institutions. And when that proactive type of reform happens, then polarization around the value of democracy is less likely to emerge. On the other hand, when formal institutions and procedures fail in this regard, citizens are understandably more ambivalent about what parties and democratic institutions are really worth, and polarization around democracy becomes more likely, putting democratic regimes at risk. I'll stop there.
Thanks. All right, that gives us a little over half an hour for discussion. Felicia, will you kick us off?
All right, thanks everybody. I want to bring one more variable into the discussion, which touches on your points about state capacity, Juan Pablo, which is that we're not really talking about technocracy. And in some ways, one view of what happened to parties is actually that a lot of the political battles got removed from political spheres. We put technocrats in charge of lengthening time horizons. Congress in most Latin American countries does nothing around actual policy making or control of the budget. And so I'm wondering, is it actually about a weakening of the state or a kind of shrinking of the political space and actually parties' involvement in fundamental political decisions? So I want to hear a little bit more how technocracy and the growth of technocracy might have contributed to the weakening of parties. Second, I do want to talk more about polarization. Jana put it on the table a bit and different types of polarization, but it's true that, you know, here at Dr. Class and in many spaces, we have events about, oh, the growing polarization of the region. And I think Fernando and Juan Pablo, you sort of made it sound like, you know, we're collapsing into a world of fart jokes and sort of fragmented cleavages. But the other story is that we are seeing policy and effective polarization that is a force for party building. So what type of polarization do you see on the rise in the region? And are some of the successful cases of maybe Morena or in its moment Mas actually, or even the revival of the PT, examples of this polarization revitalizing certain political projects?
I committed myself to silence, but I wanted to just build on the point about Morena. I know none of you are Mexico experts, but AMLO seems like a guy who went back in time and shouldn't have been able to handle the sort of the demands of 21st century politics, and yet he's the guy who sort of defied the laws of gravity and built a party that actually won re-election. Are there any lessons that we can learn from AMLO and Morena? Let you guys go through that, and then we'll take a round of questions from the group. So why don't we go in same order? Fernando?
Well, thank you all. I think I'll tackle the question of the polarization issue. I'll leave the AMLO question to someone who claims to be a Mexican expert. I will just not touch that. I think that the point that Alicia brings is indeed an important one, but it seems to me that one issue that explains why this kind of current polarization is different from the kind of perpetual or kind of intense conflict that generates stronger parties in the kind of framework that Steve, for example, has put forward before, is that this polarization is itself kind of somewhat disconnected from the social movements and this kind of social base of a polarized society that kind of generates party building out of it. Right, and so this is a polarization that is happening on Twitter, right? Like it's a polarization that is happening kind of on the discourse level. And while there is obviously translation of that into societal polarization, and people kind of like hate each other, I absolutely dread the idea of going back home and going to a family party today in Brazil. This dynamic hasn't really kind of being transformed into polarized social movements, into the kind of societal basis of polarization that really become the kind of building blocks of new parties, right? And so I think what you have is this kind of very intense despise for each other, but it has very shallow roots. And the shallowness of the roots of this polarization just won't really translate itself into more party building. You will just most likely kind of get us stuck at this kind of like hating of everyone and at all the time. That will help with political mobilization in the short term, right? Like, so we can kind of all rally around defeating the other guy because we hate the other guy. But as soon as we've defeated the other guy, the shallowness of the roots of our connections will just kind of be exposed, and we can't really do much out of this. And I think that that's kind of what that you mentioned the PT. That's really what has happened with the Workers' Party government today, right? Like, he was this kind of broad front to defeat Bolsonaro, but then shortly after he comes to power, the front collapses. There is really nothing out of it, right? Like, the Workers' Party cannot really do much. The front itself was essentially this connection between different leadership groups. There wasn't really anything out of it. And it just kind of becomes this kind of, it gets stuck on this slippery slope of we always have to return to the opposition against Bolsonaro because nothing really comes out of it.
Pablo.
Okay. Let me first address Alicia's point about like technocracy and state capacity. I think those two issues are more related than you implied in your question. Like, part of the reason why politics gets away from people's demands and kind of cannot represent what people is demanding, as Jana put it, has to do with the technocratic turn, globalization, and what room that left for policy divergence at the nation state level, right? So I think they are both more like both phenomena are connected in different ways. But I think also, and this is what I want to push a little bit more, it's also a matter of capacity, right? It's not just that you have this kind of like elite discussing things that are not, or doing things that are not that important to people and that don't seem that important to people on the ground. It's also that, and this has to do with, for instance, the growth of phenomena like criminal governance in Latin America, in which more and more spaces in society are not being governed by the state, but by subaltern actors that are better providers to the people on the ground than the state and that politicians, right? The other thing I would like to say, and perhaps this speaks about also the case of Frente Amplio that Fran put up there in her questions, but I can address that later, has to do with the role of state in society. The parties we miss today were essentially clientelistic parties that funded most of their activities on the ground on the basis of state resources, right? You have, when the state retires from society, when the state presence in society weakens, that also weakens the political organizations that were there, bridging demands and essentially intermediating favors and needs for the people, right? So no one here likes clientelism, but clientelism and state clientelism provided and fulfilled that role in sustaining the organizations you need to have parties. That sounds bad, but it's part of what was there. And your point about technocracy also has to do with that, right? I mean, with the changing role of a state in society in Latin America. In terms of polarization, I think we are, and Fernando alluded to this in some ways, we are lending too much attention to polarization. We are calling everything that we don't like polarization. The same goes for populism. I think these are ways of not getting what's really happening instead of ways of better understanding what's really going on. I think we are obsessed and to our bad with this type of phenomenon and debate in political science today. In terms of Mexico, Steve, I think part of what AMLO did was, and this old-fashioned political intermediation has to do with what other parties and leaderships in the region has quit doing, right? And the other thing I think it's quite obvious, and Fernando also mentioned the commodity boom as a period in which parties kind of had a better capacity to entrench themselves in society for a little longer. Nearshoring, in the case of Mexico, is also part of the explanation, I would say, for AMLO's and Morena's performance.
Thanks. Jana?
Yeah, I don't have a ton to add, but I'm going to just build briefly on the points about technocracy in response to Alicia's question. And I think to me, one of the core things that we need to ask ourselves with regard to the advance of technocracy is about how that affects the allocation of power, and to whom and for whom is power allocated, and how is it distributed. And I think that, technocratic policymaking is going to benefit someone, and the effort to depoliticize policymaking does still allocate power and resources. And I think what's frustrating for a lot of people kind of on the ground about technocratic policymaking is that it removes those issues from the public sphere. And that's what you're talking about, I think, when you're asking, how does this affect parties? And I think what's problematic for parties in this isn't just that they don't get to debate the issues, but rather that they, I think, can use the technocratic process as an excuse for owning distributional choices, because the technocratic process is in effect still doing that on their behalf. And so I think they're sort of suffering, they suffer the consequences of those choices, even if they are trying to distance themselves from them.
Okay, let me take a few questions from the audience. So, Carl?
So, just a general question for the three of you, probably. What would you make of the unsuccessful attempt of social movements to gather, because there are many social movements that are very good in Latin America in representing these demands that are not being represented by political parties. Why is it that social movements haven't been successful? Probably the exception would be Bolivia, but why they haven't been successful in coalescing or gathering or representing or reaching to, or just governing? So what's the problem there? What's the linkage problem there? And the second question is more for Juan Pablo. It's a kind of convoluted question, Juan Pablo, so sorry for that. But I want to go back to your two dimensions, the spatial and the temporal dimension of representation. So when you talk about the spatial dimension, my impression is that you are alluding to some form of collective dimension of democracy. So political parties, union, even the radio back in the mid-20th century, public goods, public space, public education, all of that was a phenomenally important dimension of democracy. And I think that that dimension that you're referring alludes to the failure of that. And the reason why I'm asking is because we still handle a definition of democracy that makes no reference whatsoever to the collective dimension of democracy. So I was wondering whether you have anything to say about that.
Claudia.
Thank you. And I was thinking that if it is the death of clientelistic parties, good death. I mean, why do we want to rescue them? It's part of the democratization process of Latin America. And so if that's the type of crisis that we are referring to, I don't think that's really a sort of a bad outcome. The point is, what are we going to replace them with? Because we need to, as almost all of the presenters have said, party has to accomplish different tasks. And probably different tasks needs different types of organization. Sort of representing causes and cleavages is one thing. Linking society to a state is a different thing, right? And competing for power through electoral process is a totally different thing. So I will say that parties that remain in place probably are successful enough to link at least some issues or cleavages with the electoral process. That's the sort of the tool link that they have been able to do. That's, for example, what, I don't know, Pacto Histórico in Colombia has been able to do, or AMLO in Morena has been able to do. But maybe we need to create different types of networks and do some more sort of social type of network to work with people to improve, formation of leadership or representation of causes. and acknowledge that that's different to have a structure for electing people, which is a very different, very particular task. Then you need to be good, not necessarily at representing people and representing causes, but probably at collecting money and legally, and recruit people who want to come into this type of job that is not easy, and supporting them through the process. So I don't know, sometimes I think we are sorry for things that are actually good for democracy. The decline of clientelistic parties is a good news for democratization in Latin America. The point is, how are we going to replace them? For what type of networks or institutions are we going to replace them, instead of, looking at the past, hoping that we can come back to something that actually caused too much trouble? I don't know. That's sort of my question, my point.
Nathan.
Yeah, thank you for this great panel. My question builds a little bit on Claudia's point on the future of parties. So even though there were some examples on parties that have survived, such as the PT or now Morena in Mexico, so the assumption that parties have been failing has been mostly embraced, but at the same time, there are new parties that are emerging in Latin America and perhaps more clearly in Europe, like far-right parties. And now is this like one of the main lines of research in political science. So can these parties be institutionalized and become the new type of parties? This might be either far-right ideologies or other types of parties, but these are other types of parties that have been growing. So can these parties be the new norm? And the second question is, so Jana made a point referring to the role of marginalization in Latin America, but also some of these processes have been driven by not necessarily marginalized citizens, but like rich white voters who have been also endorsing like these other types of parties. And so what is the role of different types of groups in the demise of traditional parties?
And guy next to you had a question?
Oh, yes. Yeah, thanks. I wanted to ask a question about polarization, but Juan Pablo convinced me to talk about something else. So I want to ask, I feel like the general tenor of this panel is rather pessimistic, and I share that pessimism and alarm with our current moment. But it also strikes me that the pessimism of now is a stark contrast to probably the optimism of when this current party moment started. And you all kind of point to the transition to democracy, I guess, in late 80s, 90s as like the start of this current party moment. So I wonder if part of the thrust is trying to explain the erosion of centrism and the erosion of parties. Is there something instructive from either the literature or the actors from the founding of this moment? I think a rather optimistic founding of this moment 30 or 40 years ago that could be instructive for us helping to understand its decay now.
All right, that's a lot. You guys should feel free not necessarily to answer all of them. Just take the ones that you feel best equipped to answer. Take 3 or 4 minutes and go. Let's start with Fernando again.
Thank you. So I will kind of tackle several questions at once, and that gives me a chance to also disagree slightly with Juan Pablo's very strong pessimism about the future of parties. I tend to be a little bit less pessimistic about this kind of things, and I think the kind of the core of the pessimism stems from the expectation of what politics will look like in the future and what are the incentives for political organization in democracies in general, right? I tend to think that if we take a narrow definition of parties and we think of parties as mass-based parties, I am 100% on board that the kind of parties that we had in the past are unlikely to emerge today. And for many of the reasons that I and Juan Pablo have discussed, right? There are technological transformations, the societies have become post-industrial, and et cetera, et cetera. However, and that goes to the point about why is it that social movements can't do some of these things? Why is it that other parties that are emerging, how can they institutionalize? think one thing that is true is that democracy creates incentives for the emergence of some kind of organization that will help politicians win election and organize them once they are in Congress. And there exists this thing that's Congress, and politicians have to kind of operate inside pre-existing rules that are there already. And these rules just create incentives for things that we may not call parties, but they damn look like parties, right? And so, yes, they won't be kind of the mass party, but they will damn look like parties. And that's why social movements can't do it, because social movements don't organize people in Congress. And when they do, they become parties, right? That's the whole thing. And so I think the kind of, I'm less pessimistic. I think the parties that we had in the past might be dead, and we might not be able to go back to them. But democracy, as we know it, just has kind of built in a set of institutional devices that creates incentives for some kind of organization that looks like party, right? Like I keep coming back in my mind as I was thinking about the discussions we were having, how, for example, in Brazil, there was this institutional innovation of what they call the collective mandate, in which a group of 6 or 7 people would come together and try to kind of say they are all part of the mandate, right? They are all kind of the representative, and they would be kind of a collective representative of a social group. But then what happens? They are elected. They are elected as this kind of group of 7 people. But what happens? Well, only one of them can be on the ticket. Only one of them can be the federal deputy. And so what this person does is then they nominate the other 6 as kind of as secretaries or whatever. But they are not representative. They are not casting votes. They are not collecting payments. They're not doing any of that, right? Because these institutions just shape politics in this way. So unless the whole kind of edifice of liberal democracy is transformed, I am much less pessimistic. I think we'll just keep having things that we may not call parties, but they will walk like parties, they will quack like parties, and they will be parties.
So you're optimistic, Fernando, because the future of parties is the central.
Yes, and because they have a whole career as a party scholar to build, so they just can't go away.
Juan Pablo.
Okay, I'll try to address 3 points. One, it's the Carla's point about the collective dimension. I'm totally agree with your point, Carla. I mean, like political representation has to do with grievances about public goods and public good provision, right? And when you don't have public goods, when you have like, think about poor Milei voters, right? Who try to, I'm thinking about like Pablo Seman's argument that these people was arguing that they didn't want anything to do with the state, right? And those are the ones that needed the state the most. And at the same time, they say, I don't want the state to be part of my life. This is like informals in Peru. It's the same type of rationale, right? But that comes after like 40 years of the state providing public baths, right? And politicians abusing people on the basis of their needs and mobilizing people through clientelistic payoffs and so on, right? So when societies get so segmented, when public good provision, like everyone that can privatize their health, their insurance, their security, do that, right? Public good sucks, right? And politicians cannot compete anymore in terms of this collective dimension that you rightly claim needs to be incorporated into our view of democracy. This takes me to Claudia's point. My argument, Claudia, is not normative, but descriptive, right? Like, I don't want to rescue clientelistic parties. What I'm saying is you cannot have it both ways. In unequal societies without public goods, clientelism was functional in entrenching party organizations in society. You can do away with clientelism, but you are doing away with the parties you are missing as well. And if you say, well, I mean, what you need to compete today is money, in unequal democracies, that leads to oligarchy, not to a better democracy without clientelistic parties, right? And I think like that's part of the reality we have to grapple with. Let me address Fran's point out the Frente Amplio and people in Uruguay having access to cell phones, because I think it's important. Things in Uruguay take time. The country is very slow moving, but if you look at the campaign now happening in the country, there is an increasing turmoil in the Frente Amplio between people that claims that leaders have are not listening to comités de base, they are not relating to the party's base organization that is well described in Rosenblatt, Pinheiro, and Perez's book, right? Because they are bypassing that in political structure through technology. And that's creating, I think, a lot of discontent and malaise within the Frente Amplio base that eventually will catch the party and eventually will create consequences in the timing that things happen in Uruguay, right? Which is very slow. I'll leave it there. I'm sorry.
Thanks. Jana?
Yeah, so I think I'm going to try to address the first question and the last together. So the first was sort of why aren't social movements successful intermediaries? And then the last was how can the past help us understand party building now? And I actually think those two are very related. So I think that the past tells us that, you know, obviously party building is hard. It requires extensive investment in grassroots network building, and it requires you know, just really not just extensive networks, but networks that have a lot of different nodes in them. This is from some recent work by Mariana Justi Rodriguez about indigenous party building. But we can see this happening, you know, in the past where we had maybe less sophisticated data, you know, tools of data analysis. But this was happening in labor unions, through churches, other types of grassroots organizations that formed the sort of building blocks of the parties that came to be the parties that are now falling apart, right? And I think that while social movements cannot directly replace parties, they can become the building blocks upon which new parties can be structured. And so I think the question is, how do you bring together social movements in a way that enable them to be successful intermediaries for a collective, right? So I think one of the challenges with social movements today is, as Juan Pablo said, they're sort of bifurcated, and there's lots of different issues that people are concerned with. And I think that in order to build parties that are concerned with advancing the public good, those movements need to be brought together and built into more cohesive networks that can provide the foundation for building new parties. But this is a very slow process. It's not necessarily something that can happen overnight. And I don't think that parties that, you know, pop up in one election and win are going to be the types that survive in the long term.
Let me take one question from online and kind of marry it with a resurfacing of Natan's question, which was only partially answered there at the end, which has to do with the new electoral vehicles that are emerging. So one question is, how do you evaluate their capacity to take root? I think it was Juan Pablo who used the lovely metaphor of infant mortality, that in fact the record so far in the 21st century doesn't look good in terms of, and actually this was Jana's last point, most of them do seem to be dying pretty early on. But how do you evaluate the prospects for institutionalization of these maybe new right, maybe not, parties? And secondly, do you see these new electoral vehicles as potentially more prone to authoritarianism than the parties of the good old days? may or may not have been Democratic. Why don't we reverse the order and start with Jana?
You caught me off guard. I was enjoying the putting Fernando on the hot seat
I
there.
had to give Fernando a break.
Yeah.
Guy's got to teach in 5 minutes.
I basically think that in general that these of the moment electoral vehicles are not lasting. We can, just the empirical record can tell us that is in fact true. That said, I think that there are some emerging organizations that do have the potential to become parties that we recognize as such that have some staying power, but I don't think that we see very many of those yet on it, like actually competing in elections. I think that probably where the action is really at a much more grassroots level, sort of proto parties, perhaps we might say. And then, to respond to the question about whether these kinds of electoral vehicles are more prone to authoritarianism, I think they're certainly obviously more prone to personalism, which is easily manipulated into sort of autocratic tendencies. I don't think that there's necessarily anything fundamentally autocratic about personalist electoral vehicles, but I think, the nature of the way in which these types of leaders are coming onto the scene is that they're catalyzing opposition to the system, and that anti-system sentiment that they're capitalizing on makes it such that they are positioned in a sort of anti-democratic way, because that's what the system is. So I don't necessarily think that electoral vehicles per se are inherently more autocratic, but I think the nature of the context in which these populist personalist leaders are coming onto the scene is that they're building a base precisely in that kind of anti-system logic, and that logic is anti-democratic.
Pablo?
Yeah, let me say that Fernando has to teach in 5 minutes, but has a good textbook to help him. So, like, this speaks also to Nathan's question. Thanks, Fernando. Thanks. This speaks also to Nathan's question. I think, the point I would make is the following, right? Like every leader wants to institutionalize their rule and their eventually, their political organization. I think we are being too quick in linking this type of leadership, right, to democratic erosion and like democratic backsliding, right? Many might attempt to do so, but they are failing also to do so in many places, and we have to be conscious of that, right? So where have they succeeded in doing that? Essentially, when they can capture a significant chunk of the economy and of private or public goods that let them institutionalize their rule, right? And this can happen at a la East European in some way, in which you have this kind of like piranha capitalism and regulatory capture of by the state of the private economy that leads to the entrenchment of these autocratic leaders. Or it can happen a la Latin American way in narco states, right? And like in the midst of political economies that provide these leaderships leverage to keep their power and eventually like kill democracy. But I think in many other places, you see these new vehicles, these new leaderships that essentially come and go to office because they cannot deliver in what they are offering, right? And if you think about like Europe, Western Europe, right? I mean, some people is estimating that in the next 10 years, 50 million Africans will try to migrate to Europe, right? How will that make this type of leaderships be able to deliver on their promises without essentially like violating human rights or suppressing democracy, right? So if you think about a process in which democratic contestation endures, and it's enduring in many places in the world today, these political strategies are probably enough to win an election or 2 elections, but are not sustainable in the long run in terms of the type of demand and the type of electoral basis you are trying to court with these discourses, and the difference between that and your ability to deliver on your promises.
Fernando, you have the final word before rushing off to class.
Thank you. Can the new right institutionalize? I think they absolutely can. And here I will talk mostly on the Brazilian experience because that's what I know best. I think they have everything that would let them institutionalize. While they did win the 2018 election, being 6 guys in a room making fart jokes, they were not that, and they are not that. They do have social bases on evangelical movements. They had quite strong base connecting, for example, the Bolsonaro movement with the Brazilian arms industry that funded a lot of this and that emerged in the 2005 plebiscite for disarmament, right? That created a network of national organizations that was behind a lot of what happened in the past 6 years. And they also are connected to groups related to the police, to the army. So they are not disconnected from society, and they could then institutionalize out of this. They are just kind of not the kind of social movements and civil society organizations we usually think are the basis of strong parties, but they are there. There are religious groups, there are this kind of state officials groups. These things are there, right? So they could definitely have institutionalized. Why didn't the Bolsonarism institutionalize a strong party? Well, first, because they are extraordinarily incompetent at doing this, right? Like they never did it. And so they are extraordinarily incompetent. And I mean that seriously, right? Like they tried to create a party, Aliança Brasil, while holding the presidency. And creating a party in Brazil is extremely easy. There are 50 of them out there. And they still could not come up with 700,000 signatures, right? They can easily come up with like thousands of people for a rally, but they could not come up with 700,000 signatures. That's all they needed. So they were extraordinarily incompetent at this. And the second reason, and that is really the most important one, that didn't really make them kind of pull it up by the bootstraps, is that they had alternatives. The Brazilian right is not dead. Right, like the 2 largest parties in Brazil today are the PP, which is the Arena, the kind of millionth version of the Arena, and the PL, which was the right party created in 1985. So these parties have been quite successful too. They have not failed. They do not win presidential elections, but they do things well. And so one reason why the Brazilian right wing, or this new right, hasn't institutionalized is because it has found a home in already institutionalized parties. But so they didn't need to, but they could if the incentives were there.
Great. Please join me in thanking Fernando Bizzarro.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Next week,
Thanks, everybody.
we have an in-person session next week. It is Gabriela Levy who's speaking on bias in the evaluation of violence against civilians. So see you next week.